Right, let's start today's session. So far in our journey, just a very quick recap. We have focused on the initial giving of the instruction or the commandment, right, in the Exodus, when they were first instructed to do it as the people of Israel is first instructed to do it when they were leaving Egypt and running out of food. And then after that, we also talk about the giving of the 10 commandments in Exodus 20. So today we are going to carry along in the timeline to move a little bit further down and see how the understanding of Sabbath expands as the community of God's people grows and evolves and moves from place to place. All right. So before we do that, we are going to start with prayer. So let's close our eyes. Our Father in heaven, we are grateful for this moment, grateful for our community, grateful for the chance to be able to learn from your word and to know your heart, to know what you desire for your people. God, it is a privilege. So we ask, Lord, that you open our ears to hear from you today. Soften our hearts that we will receive your word and stir our spirits, God, to respond accordingly. We commit ourselves to you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, so as I was saying, we're going to move along in the timeline to see how the understanding of Sabbath expands and evolves. And in particular, we're going to approach it from this one common theme. As we explore the understanding of Sabbath, we see God's concern for justice. So Sabbath and how it links with God's desire for justice. And we'll be looking at 4 different passages of scripture today. So the first one, it's a familiar one, Exodus chapter 20. It's the one where God gives Moses the 10 commandments. And in our first session together, we actually looked at this, the 4th commandment. And part of that, in verse 10, it says, on the Sabbath, you shall not do any work, neither you nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. So here in this commandment, in this passage, we see a little bit of an inkling of God's concern for those on the margins, right? You know, for us, when we think about rest, often we think about how we need to rest and we make plans for ourselves to be able to rest. And for most of us, we include our family members and close friends in that concept of rest. So we are concerned for them. And we want them to rest. But here in the 4th commandment, right, God actually demands that we do more than that, right? That we're not just concerned for ourselves and even not just concerned for just our family. We also need to seek out our neighbors to care for the slaves under our care. And even more than that, moving even further outwards to be like ecologically minded, right, and include the natural world, animals, in this concept of rest. So God, through the Sabbath, challenges us to expand our concern outwards, right, beyond just the inner circles of ourselves and our family. God calls us to move into the outer circles, to care for our slaves, or in the modern context, perhaps our employees or the people under our care that we lead. And to move even further out, to care for the foreigners, to care for creation and the natural world. So God calls us to expand our concern outwards towards those who are on the margins of our social consciousness. And that is really what justice is about. Right, so this feeling of an expanding concern is further emphasized when we carry on in the timeline of how God introduces Sabbath to Israel, right? This expanding concern. So far, we've only talked about the Sabbath day, right? Which is 1 day a week where we rest. Further down in Leviticus, God actually expands this to talk about the Sabbath year. All right, so let's read Leviticus 25, verse 1 to 7. When you enter the land I'm going to give you, the land itself must observe a Sabbath to the Lord. For 6 years, sow your fields, and for 6 years, prune your vineyards and gather their crops. But in the 7th year, the land is to have a year of Sabbath rest, a Sabbath to the Lord. Do not sow your fields or prune your vineyards. Do not reap what grows of itself or harvest the grapes of your untended vines. The land is to have a year of rest. Whatever the land yields during the Sabbath year will be food for you, for yourself, your male and female servants, and the hired worker and temporary resident who live among you, as well as for your livestock and the wild animals in your land. Whatever the land produces may be eaten. So this Sabbath year, it is an extension of the weekly Sabbath day. Just doesn't that sound so wonderful and glorious? One whole year of rest. It just sounds so amazing to be able to rest for 1 year. And you know, we can read in Leviticus 25, it seems like the primary concern here is for the land, right? God seems to be concerned about the land because it needs to rest from being worked on by humans. I guess for us, we don't really think about land or nature as having needs, right? And we certainly don't think that humans have to be mindful of the needs of the land or even that we are supposed to meet those needs. I think most of us, our primary concern is about what the land can do for us. Humanity, like we have just spent a lot of time finding all kinds of ways to squeeze as much as we can out of the earth, whether it's oil or food or whatever resource or space, right? When we think about our human relationship to the land, it's often more about what the land must do for us rather than what we owe to it. But isn't it quite important when the God of creation tells us how to care for his creation? It is like the manufacturer gave us an instruction manual on how to take care of this thing that he made, right? So obviously you better pay attention. Obviously we should listen, but unfortunately we don't. And so God here is telling the people that this Sabbath year is one whole year meant to give the land a break, to stop like milking it and forcing it to produce what we want it to produce, and instead we just eat whatever the land produces during this time without human intervention. And so as the people allow the land to rest, allow creation to rest, then the rest actually flows inwards. In this passage, it's a little bit flipped, right? Previously, it flowed outwards. You rest so that everybody else can rest. In the Sabbath year, the land rests, and then the rest flows inwards, so that the animals, the slaves, and all the people involved in caring for the land can rest as well. So that's the Sabbath year. So God, being the wonderful, abundant God that he is, right, continues expanding the Sabbath even further, right? He goes from the Sabbath day to the Sabbath year to the year of Jubilee. So in the passage just after that, in Leviticus 25, it says this. We're not going to read all of it. We'll just read certain portions. It says in verse 8, count off 7 Sabbath years, 7 times 7 years, so that the 7 Sabbath years amount to a period of 49 years. Consecrate the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. Each of you is to return to your family property and to your own clan. The 50th year shall be a jubilee for you. Do not sow and do not reap what grows of itself or harvest the untended vines. For it is a jubilee and is to be holy for you. Eat only what is taken directly from the fields. In this year of Jubilee, everyone is to return to their own property. So here we see the year of Jubilee. It's the year after 7 cycles of Sabbath years. So it's the 50th year, right? And in this 50th year, the land actually gets to rest as well in the year of Jubilee, which means that actually the land rests for 2 years in a row. Right, because on the 49th year, it's a cycle of 7. So the land rests on the 49th year, and it also rests on year 50. So 2 years in a row. And the amazing thing is that God knows the concern of humans. He knows that we care a lot about what we're going to eat or whether we get to eat. And so God, as he's giving all these instructions, he very specifically promises in verses 20 and 22 God says that in this cycle, on the 6th year, He will send a great blessing, and the land will produce a crop that is enough for 3 years. So after the 6th year, it will produce, on the 6th year, it will produce a crop that's enough for 3 years. So they will be able to eat on the 7th year and the 8th year, right, when they are resting and not working the land. And then on the 9th year, when they start to work the land, there's still no food yet, right? So they will eat the remaining from that 6th year. And then when the food runs out, just nice, they will be harvesting a new crop on the 10th year. And I'm quite amazed by that. I mean, like, seriously, this is really very precise and adequate provision by God. Since God is the one who calls them to rest for 2 years, God says, I call you to rest, but I will provide for you enough so that you can do it. I mean, can you can you just imagine that you're an Israelite in that time, right? The amount of faith it would take for you to trust in this provision. And then also imagine that as you trust in this provision, as you follow this command, imagine how much your faith will grow when you actually see God's promises come to pass. I think that's just like mind-blowing to see that actually all of that in real-time action. And then the year of Jubilee is also very special, this 50th year, because it's a year of liberty throughout the land for all its inhabitants. Later on in the passage, we didn't read it, but you can feel free to go and look at it when we're done. Right, God makes a lot of provisions. He talks about what it means to rest on this year of Jubilee. And as you read it, right, I think you can really feel the heart of God for the people. Right? And through it, you can see that God actually really understands the ups and downs of human life. He understands that sometimes we get stuck. Sometimes we have bad days, bad years, bad seasons. And God makes provisions so that nobody will have to stay stuck forever. So one of the big things about the year of Jubilee, right, is that if you have been forced to sell off your land during difficult times, and then for many years you try to buy it back, but you can't, you're struggling to get enough money to buy back your land, during the year of Jubilee, your land will be returned to you. Like, what? I think this is a reflection that God knows that it's not easy to be a human, and sometimes you fall on bad times, and sometimes even with your best efforts, it's very, very hard to break out of the poverty cycle on your own. God knows that, and so God built into Israel's economic system a way out of poverty, a way of redemption. Right? God understands. He understands that poor people are not poor because they are lazy. Right? In fact, sometimes poor people work harder than all of us, but it's just the system that traps them in this cycle. So let me give you a modern day example. So I have a lot of social workers in my life, my sister and my friends, and I hear about the struggles of people living in poverty. So I'll give you an example of the system trapping someone. All right, so let's say you need to buy an appliance, a necessity like iron, or I don't know what's in this, TV, or something that is necessary for you to use, right? And so we'll go to COS or Harvey Norman or whatever to buy this appliance, right? And most of these places, they offer an installment program. So you can pay slowly over several months, several years. For those of us who can afford it, we normally choose to just pay for the whole thing upfront, right? Or we might choose to pay installments, but no problem. We can normally pay our installments on time, and then that's that. But for those who are poor, they will opt for installments that they think they should be able to handle, right? Based on their income, they're like, okay, maybe I will take like 5 years, 10 years to pay for this appliance. And normally they can meet the payments until something unexpected happens, like maybe a medical emergency, or suddenly need to pay for their children's textbooks or something like that, right? So a sudden expense comes up, and suddenly they cannot pay the installment anymore. So now they have to pay interest, right? So this accumulates interest, late fees, whatever, it accumulates. And the reality is that it becomes too much. You know, sometimes even after many, many years, the appliance is already broken, they already throw away, families are still paying for this. They're still paying the installments on something that is already broken and thrown away. And they end up paying double of what the retail price actually is, which is how the poor get poorer, because the system traps them. They aren't lazy, they're trying their best. But the system just traps them in this cycle of poverty. And God understands that. God understands that when you fall on bad times, sometimes it's really very hard to crawl out of that hole. And so God, He built an economic system that was just. A system that will not penalize you just because you are poor. A system that gives you a way out once every 50 years. And along those same lines, in the year of Jubilee, if you are an Israelite who has been forced to work for a fellow Israelite as hired labor or as a bound laborer in order to pay off your debts because your land is not doing well, right? So you work for someone else. During the year of Jubilee, you can be set free. Similarly, if you're a slave from a foreign nation, you've been sold to the people of Israel to work for them in their homes. During the year of Jubilee, you can be set free. Not only you, your children, your whole family can be set free, and you can go home to wherever you came from. I mean, just imagine that. Right? In the land of Israel, in the year of Jubilee, there is mass liberation, mass forgiveness of debts, and everyone gets to go home. I mean, is there any greater testimony than this of the extraordinary grace and justice and mercy of God? Once every 50 years, people will see that there's great rejoicing in Israel as everybody's debts are forgiven. I know that it's hard for us to comprehend or imagine, right? How can this be reasonable? How does an economy like this work? Shouldn't we pay back what they owe? Isn't that fair? I mean, is it fair that people's debts are just forgiven? Is it fair that land is just returned in this way? Well, I think the Bible challenges us today to consider that maybe this is fair, that it is fair for an economy to work this way, because God's justice doesn't always make sense when you compare it to the standards of this world. But in God's eyes, this economic system, year of Jubilee, this is fair. It is fair that we do not profit from another person's desperate circumstances, right? It is fair that we don't charge exorbitant interest on loans. It is fair that we do not accumulate land and wealth for ourselves to a point that our neighbors suffer. It is fair that we consider the circumstances that lead people to poverty rather than just judging them and dismissing them as lazy people who do not deserve help. The Jubilee year is God's definition of what is fair. And really, it is the culmination of the philosophy of Sabbath, right? From your rest and on the Sabbath day to the Sabbath year to the Jubilee year. I feel like that kind of, like, this is the kind of God that we follow. And that gives me so much hope. Yeah, but I think that at this point it's worth pointing out that actually most biblical scholars agree that Israel never practiced the Jubilee year. That they didn't. And it is also likely that they actually did not even practice the Sabbath year. And I mean, I think we can empathize, like, right? It's very difficult to do this, you know. You ask me to keep Sabbath one day a week, it's very hard, then you still ask me to keep Sabbath for one whole year, right? It is difficult. So we can empathize why they might have struggled to keep the Sabbath year. But for Jubilee, I think it's a little bit more insidious than that, right? I mean, it's not likely that they practice Jubilee because during the year of Jubilee, everybody has to give everything back. So it actually prevents accumulation of wealth in the hands of a few people. And we know from our current observation of life that people with wealth and power, they do not want to give it up. So the reality is that the rich probably just refuse to practice Jubilee. And if all the rich people refuse to practice Jubilee, then there's not much that the poor or anyone can do about it. And so they never did practice Jubilee or Sabbath year. And with all of this, I imagine that the land was exhausted and the land cried out to God for rest. And the poor and the economically vulnerable, they cried out to God for provision. And the slaves, they cried out to God for liberation. And I believe that God acted because just a little bit later in Leviticus 26, it actually warns the people. It warns of what will happen if they do not keep the Sabbath year and Jubilee year. And God tells them, then the land, if you don't keep my commandments, you don't keep Jubilee, you don't keep Sabbath year, then the land will enjoy its Sabbath years all the time that it lies desolate, and when you are in the country of your enemies. Then the land will rest and enjoy its Sabbaths. All the time that it lies desolate, the land will have the rest it did not have during the Sabbaths that you lived in it. And this is what we now, on hindsight, what we understand to be what the exile was for. You know, the people of Israel, right? They lived in the promised land for a while, but then they were exiled, they were scattered, taken away from their promised land and forced to live in the country of their enemies. And the land was desolate. And when you look at Leviticus 26, you understand why. Because they did not keep the Sabbath year, they did not keep Jubilee year, and this was the consequence. They had to be chased out of the land so that to make up for all the years, the Sabbath years that they missed. So, through Sabbath day, Sabbath year, Jubilee year, we see God's desire for justice, expanding concern for the people, for the slaves, for the foreigners, for the land. And finally, we jump to the fourth passage, which is in the New Testament. Finally, we got to the New Testament, to Jesus, right? Where Jesus very simply and very directly explains what the Sabbath is about. It's in Matthew chapter 12, verse 1 to 13. So what happens there is that we see some Pharisees finding fault with Jesus because he seems to be doing work on the Sabbath, right? And by their strict interpretations, Jesus and his disciples have violated an important commandment. They are not supposed to be working. But before we give the Pharisees a hard time about being so annoying, just remember, right? I mean, I was just telling you about it, that Israel had been in exile for 70 years. And through exile, they realized that they were in exile because they had failed to keep God's laws. So now they are a bit scared lah, right? They will be very careful to make sure that they keep God's laws, that they keep the Sabbath so that they don't get exiled again. So that's kind of what's going on in the Pharisees' minds, that they really want to keep the command, otherwise they will be exiled again. And so they give Jesus a hard time about it, and they criticize him for what he's doing. And in the face of all this, Jesus explains to them that yes, Sabbath is important to God, but it is not the legalistic keeping of the Sabbath, of doing absolutely nothing. It is not that matters to God, right? It is the underlying principle that matters to God. And what underlies Sabbath is that God desires mercy, not sacrifice. And Jesus says that it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. And encompassing all of that is the fact that the Son of Man, Jesus, is the Lord of the Sabbath. So keeping the Sabbath is not primarily about doing nothing in a legalistic kind of way, right? Forcing yourself to like sit there and do nothing. No, the keeping of the Sabbath is about God's justice, about concern for the good of those who are on the outskirts, those who need healing, who need liberation, who need help. And that's what Jesus came to do. The Lord of the Sabbath came to rescue the weak, the vulnerable, the helpless, so that all might find rest in him. So as we rush through Leviticus and jump all the way to the New Testament, we see an expansion of the concept of Sabbath here on the left. An expansion from the Sabbath day to the Sabbath year, to the year of Jubilee, to the Lord of the Sabbath. And we also see an expansion of concern, right, here on the right. Beyond the inner circles of just yourself and your family, we're also called to be concerned for the good of our neighbors, our employees, the foreigners, even the land and the animals and creation. Sabbath and justice are deeply intertwined because that is God's heart. So I'm just going to pause and give you a moment to digest this content and to reflect on what has been shared today. I will send you the PowerPoint and I'll give you just 5 minutes to reflect. And really just a very simple question. Which part of this sharing stood out to you and why?